Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the October 16th version of Central Region Climate Outlook. We're happy to have Brian Fuchs. He's a climatologist at the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and he'll be talking about the outlook for climate and for the next few months. And you might also have seen today that the winter outlook did get released from the Climate Prediction Center in the National Weather Service, and we can talk about that later too if anybody has any questions. Brian, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, John, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Brian Fuchs, and I'm with the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, doing today's update. The agenda for today, I'm going to spend some time going over the current conditions. We'll have some information on the regional climate updates, specifically on some of the Great Lakes and agricultural happenings in the region. And the last part of the presentation, we'll look at the outlooks that have just been updated and released from the Climate Prediction Center and came out this morning. So some general information about these calls. There's a lot of collaboration that goes on, and the partners involved are stated up at the top. The next one of these webinars is going to take place on November 20th, and Dennis Toddy, the South Dakota State climatologist, is going to be leading that call. You can get information about future webinars at the first link, and the last two links are where these presentations and the slides are archived. What I'll do is go through all my slides. I have about 30 of them, and I will take questions at the very end. So I'll let John moderate those questions at the end and just jot down anything you'd like to talk about, and we'll address them then. So the current conditions in the region, I think we need to really speak up about what's been happening in Kansas City, because that has been the focal point of everything over the last couple weeks, and definitely the Royals are on my mind as well as others in the region. So that is probably the best current condition I can show you right now, and if anything, remember this slide. So for 30-day temperatures, what we've seen across the region is what we've typically been seeing through most of the summer, and it has been extended into the fall. Over the upper Midwest and into the Great Lakes, some departures anywhere from 2 to 4 degrees below normal during the last 30 days. And the further west you go, we're right at normal in parts of eastern Nebraska and Kansas, as well as into southern Missouri through Minnesota. And the further west you go, about 2 to 4 degrees, even 6 degrees above normal in some areas. And this really replicates what we've seen over the summer, that this cool weather has really impacted the region. And the further west you go, those temperatures are reversed. Some of that warmer weather did get a little further east into the region than what we've seen through much of the summer. During this time, it's also been wet for a lot of the region. You can see through Iowa into southeast Nebraska and parts of western Nebraska and South Dakota, as well as most of Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, Illinois, into Indiana and Kentucky, as well as in parts of Wisconsin. We're seeing that precipitation departures have been fairly positive in a lot of these regions, anywhere from 1.5 to 5-6 inches above normal in parts of Missouri. And a lot of these have been with some real heavy rain events that I won't say are too unusual for this time of year, but something we don't see quite as often as we have this fall on numerous occasions. We do see some dryness up in the Dakotas and parts of Minnesota, anywhere from 1.5 to 3 inches below normal just over the last 30 days. Looking at that 90-day departure from normal, quite about the same pattern through a lot of Iowa, northern Missouri, into southern Illinois. We're above normal, anywhere 6 to 9 inches, even departures up to 12 inches above normal over the last 3 months. And you can see those pockets of dryness in Minnesota and parts of eastern South Dakota, where those departures are anywhere from 3 to 6 inches below normal. But for the most part, you can generally say that the region was quite wet over the last 90 days, and that goes back until the middle of July. So year-to-date precipitation, really look at the Missouri River and places eastward and north of that area. Almost all the departures are positive in there, meaning above normal precipitation for this calendar year. There are some pockets of dryness in southern Missouri and southeast Kansas, as well as in the Dakotas, anywhere from 5 to 10 inches in some of those areas. Even in southern Missouri, some of those departures are even greater than that. But overall, the region definitely has been wetter than normal for 2014. Again, I mentioned temperatures on the 30-day map, and here's how we can see that relationship for the calendar year of 2014. Almost the entire region outside of some areas of Wyoming, Colorado, you can say was well below normal so far for this calendar year. Some of those departures in the upper Midwest of greater than 5 degrees Fahrenheit. And what we're seeing is there has been some consequences to these cool temperatures, and really looking at what the long-term consequences are going to be, and I'll touch base with that during the call today. But generally speaking, the entire region cooler than normal so far in 2014. So wetter than normal and cooler than normal for the most part. Looking at the impact of stream flows in the region, pretty much if you see a green, blue, or even a black dot on the map in the region, that's telling us of areas where we're seeing normal to much above normal stream flows for this time of year. I like looking at the 28-day average stream flows because typically you will take out any spikes associated with current rain events or some of these heavy rain events, and basically looking at the baseline long-term flow in these regions. Still looking at some of the consequences of the dryness in parts of Missouri. You can see some below normal readings in southwest Missouri as well as in central to western Kansas. A few along the Iowa and Illinois border as well, but for the most part, stream flows in the region are running normal to even quite a bit above normal. Just to point out quickly, I know California is
I'm sorry, this feature is not enabled.
California and the West, we're seeing the consequences of 3 dry years with their stream flows, at a lot of them at historical lows. So zooming into the Missouri River Basin, again, most of these readings are well above normal. Looking at some of those along the Republican River in southwest Nebraska and into north central Kansas that are still lagging behind. And again, those are going to be slow to recover. Can everyone still hear me? Okay. Still seeing some dryness in the Republican River Basin in north central to northwest Kansas. Looking at the upper Mississippi River Valley, again, almost every one of these data points is running much above normal, normal to much above normal for this time of year. And looking at the Ohio River Valley, much of the same. When you do get into some of the eastern regions of the Ohio, we do see a little more in the indications of lower stream flows.
The conference has been locked by the leader.
This region is holding steady as well.
A new participant has joined the waiting room.
So on to the Great Lakes. There has been quite the phenomenon taking place on the Great Lakes this year, where we're seeing a lot of the lakes at or above traditional levels, so high water levels in the Great Lakes. And it seems that we were just recently in the last couple of years talking about some record low levels on the Great Lakes as well. So quite the reversal. One thing that we're looking at on Lake Michigan and Lake Huron was achieving the high water mark in October, which has only happened 4 times in the last 154 years. And what is unique about this is we're probably going to see it happen this year. And even on that last statement that it could potentially even happen in November, which has never taken place in the history of the record keeping out there. And so what's responsible for these high lake levels on the Great Lakes? Again, when you look at the statewide precipitation rankings from the National Climate Data Center, you look at these readings in and around the Great Lakes, and what we can see is many of these are in the top 10 or even better readings for this year as far as their historical ranking. And so there's been a lot of water, a lot of runoff going into the lakes during this time, and really seen this on the Canadian side as well. And also what we look at was some of the ice that was on the lakes as well, where we had ice on many of the Great Lakes well into late spring and the first part of summer. when that ice is staying on, you're really looking at changes in evaporation and also water temperatures. So on the bottom left, we're looking at the lake temperatures for this time of year. And what we're seeing is they're a lot lower than what we saw in 2013. And again, some of that can be attributed to the late melt-off as well as the influx of runoff into the lakes. And you can see that they are trending quite a bit below normal, not only from just last year. So going forward, what does this mean on the lakes? I think you're going to see a potential scenario where, depending on what the weather pattern sets up like, we could see earlier onset of ice and freeze up of the lakes this year, which in turn will modify any of the air masses going over the lakes as well as impact any lake effect snow. So what we'll have to really see is moving forward what really happens this winter, and will we continue to see these temperatures trending below normal. So on to agriculture in the region. With those cool temperatures this year, what we are seeing is many areas are lagging behind in their growing degree day units. This is a base 50 map of growing degree units associated with corn, basically from April 1st, which is the traditional starting point where many producers start looking at the accumulation of these units. Not only did we have a later start to the growing season in many locations because of cold and even snowy weather well into the end of April and the first part of May, but then through the summer with the cooler than normal temperatures, we're really lacking those maturing units associated with growing degree days. So you can see that through much of the areas in blue, and even through, which again covers much of the Midwest and upper Midwest, and even into the eastern edges of the plains, that we are seeing a lot of these areas running below normal for growing degree day units, anywhere from 100 to probably 150 units in the Dakotas and Iowa and southern Minnesota. In these areas that we're seeing these departures of growing degree day units, there's definitely a concern about the crops maturing and drying down properly before they're being harvested. So that has been something that producers are looking at. But the other thing associated with this is with the ideal growing conditions this year for corn and soybeans in this region is with a slower harvest. It's meaning that this grain is getting to the local elevators at a slower pace, and they're able to handle this grain a little bit better than if we would have had an ideal maturing of these crops and harvest in full swing with a lot of grain being pushed at this time. So just something to consider for those with ag concerns. Speaking of harvest, we are seeing that the corn harvest, the light blue cones on the right for each state is the 5-year average, and the darker bluish green is the current corn harvest. So we're seeing that through the Corn Belt that every state is trending below on harvest. Places like Minnesota and Iowa are definitely trending well below normal, where Minnesota only 7% has been harvested compared to 32% at this time of year for the 5-year average, and in Iowa only 10% compared to 39% for the 5-year average. We definitely are seeing this as an impact of not only the cool weather, also some of the wet weather keeping people out of fields because of the muddy conditions, and also the crop maturing later and not ample dry down of the grain. Looking at soybeans, we're seeing a similar trend. Most all areas, again, are below their 5-year average as far as harvest. We are seeing that in portions of Minnesota and South Dakota that they're not trending too far behind, and that is in accordance with some of the dryness that we have seen. If you go back to that 30-day precipitation map, that dryness in the region has allowed, again, the crops to mature and producers to get into those fields. So just something that we're really watching, and there has been some talk up in parts of the Dakotas of keeping corn standing through the winter to allow it to dry out properly. Kind of similar conditions to what we saw in 2009 in the region. So on to soil moisture. Looking at this NL-DAS soil moisture ensemble product, looking at the total soil column, We do see some areas of above normal soil moisture through Iowa and Nebraska and into Illinois and Missouri. And then the area I've circled in red, we do see some areas that this model is showing as being below normal, anywhere from 50 to 100 millimeters below normal for this time of year. And what we're hearing from folks is this may not necessarily be reflecting what we're seeing on the ground, that the readings that are coming out of actual soil moisture monitoring systems are showing field capacity in many of these locations. So there could be several reasons to why this model isn't working as well as it could be, but definitely are looking at some anomalous results here in parts of the upper Midwest. And to solidify that fact, we're just looking at this report from the state NASS weekly crop reports and the soil moisture update that is part of that. Many of these states are showing the top 10 wetness in the upper Midwest, and even in the other portions of the region, top 20 or 25 percentile readings. So that does not correlate too well with the NLDAS model, and again, it just solidifies the need of having a better national network that does look at and monitor soil moisture conditions than what currently is in place. With that being said, all this moisture in the ground is definitely going to freeze up in the winter. We're going to have another good winter of frost depth reaching deep into the soil depending on how cold temperatures get, and we'll talk about that in the outlook. But again, there is ample moisture in the soil, and almost already we're going to be talking about what does that mean next spring when we start talking about spring planting and field conditions. So we go into the drought monitor. This is the map that was released today. And what you can see is through the region, we are not seeing much at all in the way of drought at all. We have a few pockets that are identified as abnormally dry, but for the most part, outside of portions of south central to western Kansas, the region as a whole is doing very well and predominantly drought-free. Your eyes definitely can go to the south central U.S. with the Southern Plains drought that is continuing well into its fourth year now, and also on the West Coast where we see what the results of 3+ years of drought has done to California and other states out in the West, where the drought is definitely holding pat. So looking at the current statistics that came out with the map this morning, we do see that less than 30% of the contiguous 48 states is in drought. This is the first time since December 2011 that we've been below that 30% threshold. But looking at the population being impacted by drought, especially with some of the high population regions out in the West, we still are seeing over 74 million people in the United States that are being impacted by drought right now. And like I said, the region as a whole is doing very well. When we're looking at just the north central, we only see that just right at 2% of the region is in drought, and all that is confined into the state of Kansas. Again, we have a few pockets of abnormally dry areas. Looking at where we were at the start of the calendar year, we were right at 13%, and a year ago we were at 14%. So a year ago, and even at the start of the calendar year, not a lot of drought in the region, but we have steadily improved the drought situation in this region. And just to highlight the Missouri watershed, we're seeing less than 1%. Again, that's in just the lower reaches in parts of Kansas. Compared to a year ago, we were at 11% of the Missouri watershed. And I didn't show the upper Mississippi or the Ohio because there was really no drought to talk about right now. And compared to last year, there was very little as well. So the change maps associated with the U.S. Drought Monitor, I did this for the start of the calendar year. The areas in shades of blue are showing where class improvements were made, and in the brown is where degradation has been made. And the darker the brown, more degradation, the darker the blue, the more improvement we've seen since the start of the calendar year. So you can see in portions of Iowa and Nebraska, Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin, there's been anywhere from 2 to 3 class improvements through a lot of those areas over the last calendar year, which again has wiped out all those drought concerns that we've talked about lingering from 2012 into 2013. definitely we've seen those conditions change. And we can also see in areas of the southern plains, the southwest, and the west where, again, they have seen drought develop and intensify over the same period. So now we'll get into the outlooks, and what we're going to look at is a 7-day precipitation forecast, the 8 to 14-day outlook, the monthly and seasonal, the winter, as well as the seasonal drought outlook that came out today. So over the next 7 days, again, when you're thinking about the World Series and the Royals winning it, it looks fairly dry over the next week over a lot of the Midwest and Plains states. Maybe in parts of the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes areas, we're seeing the best chance of picking up some precipitation, but still amounts less than an inch generally. So what does that mean? We typically should see some better harvest conditions through the region and maybe see some of those numbers uptick with the slow start to harvest that we have seen on the ag side. But again, fairly typical for this time of year. The 8 to 14-day outlook, we have the temperature probabilities on the left and the precipitation probabilities on the right. What we're seeing is almost for the entire country above normal chances of above normal temperatures, especially through the northern plains states and into the Midwest. Cooler than normal temperatures expected in the southeast and into Florida, even picking up Alaska on some of those above normal chances. For precipitation, what we're seeing is pretty much the Midwest and places south and east of there have a below normal expectation of precipitation during this time. Through the northern plains and into the southwest, some above normal chances. Looking at the Pacific Northwest, it looks like a little more active pattern is going to start coming in over the next week or so, and some rain catching some of those drought areas of Oregon and Washington, maybe into Northern California. And we've been talking about El Nino and the ENSO predictions since the late spring, first part of summer. I think when I did the call back in June, we really started talking about what ENSO was going to do and what does El Nino mean. And right now, with the current mid-October plume, we can see that we're right at approaching that half a degree above normal level, which is needed for El Nino to be classified, and we need to see that sustained. And if you follow the yellow line on the plume, which is the composite or the ensemble of all the different models, we can see that we're going to get slightly above that half a degree, probably to 3/4 of a degree above normal, and sustain that through the winter months and into the spring. Again, we see a lot of divergence as we get to the latter parts of this plume, but what we are looking at, what this is telling us is El Nino is going to continue to develop. It's not going to be as robust as we had first hoped or saw back in the spring and early summer, but we will see a fairly weak El Nino developing. And what does that mean for us is really the big question. Based on the probabilistic forecast, we're seeing that's fairly highly probability of El Nino in the November, December, January timeframe, and even into December, January, February. That about that 65-63% time, or level, and very little probability of getting La Nina during this time, and neutral conditions are quite low as well. So it is correlating quite well with what I talked about with the plume, and we will see some El Nino developing, but again a weaker and not too long of a lived event. So going into the monthly and seasonal outlooks, CPC has definitely been riding with the El Nino signal associated with their products for the last several months now, and this month is not much different. In November, you see a lot of equal chances in the southern plains into the Ohio River Valley and into the southeast as far as temperatures in the upper left-hand panel. Most of the other areas are showing a signal of above normal chances of above normal temperatures up into Alaska as well. And then with precipitation, we continue to see this wet signal along the southern tier of the U.S. In an El Nino year. That is not too surprising. And we also see the drier than normal precipitation probability in and around the Great Lakes and into the Ohio River Valley, which again is a classic El Nino signal. And as we get into the November through January seasonal outlooks, we continue to see the same type of pattern. The temperatures are get pulled up a little bit to more of the northern states in that November through January period. And also with the precipitation signal, we're seeing, again, quite the classic El Nino pattern as far as precipitation probabilities associated with that. Something to watch is just how dry it's going to be over the Great Lakes and into the upper Midwest and Ohio River valleys during this time. The other thing on the temperatures is it's really going to be determined by where is that northern jet going to set up and how often does it dip. If we see it up into Canada the entire winter, that temperature forecast could even be more robust. If it dips down a little bit, we could see some changes as far as where that verification will go. I also talked about the Great Lakes a little bit earlier. What this signal is showing is a warmer winter and a drier winter over the Great Lakes. So we may not see that ice develop as quickly as I had mentioned earlier, just due to what the temperatures will be like this year compared to last. But then again, if we get a ripple in the jet that dives down over the Great Lakes and brings more cool air over the Great Lakes and into the Northeast, we may see this change, but right now it's not looking like that. And the winter outlook, this came out today as well, and looking at the months of December, January, and February. Again, what I would call both the temperature on the left and the precipitation on the right are fairly classic El Nino patterns, not much different than what we saw through the November through January period. And what we're seeing again is warm conditions are expected in the probabilities over the west coast, especially from Oregon through California and up into Alaska. Cooler than normal temperatures expected in the southern U.S. As the probabilities are 40%, especially through Texas and Louisiana and into the Gulf Coast states. Again, fairly typical of what we would see with the El Nino forecast, and also associated with the above normal precipitation, which is anticipated in the above normal probabilities in the southern tier of the U.S. and into and along the East Coast. That dry signal is definitely there over the Great Lakes through the winter months. And the seasonal drought outlook really is showing a response to what this forecast with the outlooks has been showing us, and it's been fairly consistent through the last several runs. And this is taking us through the end of January. Those areas in gray is showing where drought will remain but likely improve. The areas in green are showing those areas where drought will likely be removed. What we're seeing in the browns and the yellows is where drought will persist and develop. So we're seeing some decent improvement likely along the west coast, but not that far inland, maybe catching parts of Southern California, but through much of the southern U.S., that wet signal does maintain itself over the next several months, and it's been consistent on the CPC models over the last several months. So, the way I like to look at the CPC Climate Prediction Center products is follow the trend, and the trend has been fairly consistent, not too much in the way of changes over the last 4 to 5 months, and it's continuing through the winter. So we do see the opportunity for further improvement to our drought situation. I think it's been since 2010 that we saw less than 20% of the country in drought. So it's something that as we hit that 30% mark this week, we could still see quite a bit of improvement before we hit that 20% of the U.S. in drought mark. So with that, I'll leave it open for any questions. I'll let John moderate those, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Brian. And we also have a few other folks that are on the line here today as part of our group. And besides Brian, Doug Cluck is on, and also Kevin Stamm from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And I'm sorry if I missed somebody, but otherwise, if you have any questions, just go ahead and speak up.
Yeah, Sean Johnson from North Dakota. I noticed some of the crop yields slides were missing North Dakota crop information. Was that just it wasn't provided, or is that just something you don't normally reflect?
I just focused on the major corn growing regions and soybean growing regions, with 15 different states being represented during the call. I just didn't put all of them up there, but the information is available. If you'd like to contact me offline, I'll move the slide to my contact information. You can shoot me an email or call me, and I'd gladly share the most recent numbers from the state NASS reports.
And okay. Just to add on to that, Brian, I did hear through our network, I guess you could say, that northern states are faring a little bit better, and that was not necessarily something we predicted in terms of harvest, in terms of how far they are in the harvest.
I think that, especially with the soybeans, I think that was something that has really stood out, that they were doing better than other areas, surprisingly.
And our big concern, for at least from our agency's perspective, is not so much, we're not the ag department here, but the propane consumption for drying, et cetera, so being able to extrapolate some of that out.
What we've been hearing, especially coming from the State Climate Office up in North Dakota, was many producers are looking at the condition of their fields and stock health in particular, and making the determination of leaving corn in the fields through the winter months to save on those drying costs. So really it's going to be almost on a producer-by-producer, field-by-field basis if they feel comfortable with their stands going into winter as far as leaving them up or not. So that it is going to be, in my opinion, a little trickier determining, again, some of those consumptive products like propane used for drying.
And yeah, our I guess you could say what we've also heard is that propane supplies are a little bigger, larger this year, generally speaking, compared to last year. Of course, no one, even NOAA and all of our wonderful models, no one predicted the extent and the duration of the amazing cold that we had last year. It doesn't look like we're predicting it again this year. There's always a potential for that to happen, but the likelihood based upon the forecasts and the fact that we have we're soon to have a sort of a El Nino pattern, if you will, don't necessarily point us in that direction. Not that we're going to be nice and warm, but certainly the winter we experienced last year is less likely than obviously than it was last year at this time.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Brian? Okay, well, thank you, Brian, for providing our briefing today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we'll see you again next month. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.